Hello everyone, and welcome to another Re-Phew consulting overview workshop on questionnaire design and quantitative data collection. This is the second workshop overview in a six-part as part of a six-part series relating to a research around research methodology, and this follows on from the previous workshop around research quality, validity, and ethics. And so I'm going to give this workshop in relating to the same sort of context in relating to research quality, but with a bit of a focus more on questionnaire design and quantitative data collection. The workshop objectives here are hopefully by the end of this workshop or this overview, you can understand why questionnaires are used or implemented and when to use them, and sort of how to use them. Understand the process of constructing a questionnaire, and also thereafter acknowledge the sort of key features of a good questionnaire, design, and also how to ultimately sort of ensure that quality around the survey and implementation around the survey can be maximized through the design process as well. So let's go through this then. So questionnaires to begin with, I'm going to highlight a few advantages and disadvantages, because like with any aspect that relates to research and implementation, there are advantages and disadvantages according to different sort of approaches. There will be future workshops around research methodology in a bit more depth relating to quantitative and qualitative research, but I'm going to give this context in a bit of an overview, bringing together some main points. So the advantages are that questionnaires allow an approach where there's a possibility of reaching large numbers, or a large number of people, to sort of help answer an important question, or around an important research question. The next thing around the advantages is to provide questionnaires by and large ultimately can help prompt anonymity in aspects of the implementation. That is thus to say that when whether from an academic perspective or from an industry perspective, what in questionnaires can help with, at least with getting some baseline understanding around a particular area of healthcare, let's say, for example, where anonymity is concerned, when participants get involved to complete a survey or a questionnaire, what happens is that those investigators who are implementing the questionnaire, they anonymize, or they look to anonymize those who respond by putting, for example, a number or some initials, or coding the questionnaire in a way so that they do not know who responded those questionnaires. In generally, there's this consensus where everyone is sort of anonymized from the beginning. Another advantage around questionnaires or surveys is that they are relatively inexpensive to implement, and actually in some contexts this also relates to getting sort of what I would like to refer to as sort of fast pilot data, for example, around a specific questionnaire. And then this next thing around this is that because of the way questionnaires are implemented and how for example, there are online resources to put together a questionnaire. Then it also allows opportunity where those who respond back to those surveys are after them being implemented, is that they can through those different sort of software packages or online programs that are available to help disseminate the questionnaires. Those also there are those facilities available through such packages, for example, that actually also help analyze the data and provide descriptive, at least baseline descriptive statistics around surveys, questions that look to be implemented or look to get answers and responses around. So those are some advantages. So what about the disadvantages? What are some of the disadvantages? So one of the main things is that we might not when implementing a questionnaire or survey, it might not get you might not get careful or honest information. So for example, let's say for example you implemented some questionnaire is fully organized and is developed or co-developed, for example, and you're looking to kind of maximize the responses. So one way could be to do online surveys, but also do basically grassroots have a grassroots basis for collecting data, and that might be doing, for example, surveys or questionnaires by knocking on people's doors, or being available around in a public domain, in a public area, where you might have a paper version, for example, of the questionnaire, a couple of versions of that, where people can look to complete the questionnaire. But in doing so, they might not give honest information back, because people are generally in a rush, or can be in a rush, trying to get to appointments, or just want to support and want to help, but actually at the same time they're in a rush. So you might not get careful or honest information back in that context. So that's one disadvantage. Another disadvantage is that the wording can be biased against the client's response, or against a response that even in relating to a participant who responds. So basically this comes down to how well a questionnaire is designed. So it can take a couple of weeks to come up with a decent questionnaire relating to a specific research question, for example, but in doing so, it's ensuring that the questionnaire is designed or co-developed in a way that there's a mutual basis on how the questions have been organized, so thus to reduce a bias response. So for example, if there's questions in there and there are answers, and the answers look good on paper in one way, but also give a sense of a feeling where basically what sounds good to the participants who completes that particular question or questionnaire, but also sounds good to the client. So it sounds good to the investigator as well. So basically, in that context, is a bias on both sides. So basically, the disadvantage is in this context is that it gives a kind of a skewed perspective on a research question overall or around a questionnaire, and that can ultimately affect the overall results in relating to a particular a question or questionnaire. Another disadvantage is that you might not get surveys or questionnaires returned. There may well be a low response rate, and it's important to be upfront about this and to say that that in this context, investigators should not feel alarmed or disarrayed that you might not get say for example you implemented like 100 surveys or questionnaires, or look to get a sample size around 100 questionnaires back, but only got, say for example, 15 or 20. It's not a terrible thing, but it's a disadvantage in aspects of reporting. But actually, at the same time, when reporting, it's given an honest perspective as well, and that's what questionnaires do generally, as is the case with qualitative research. It's about being honest, irrespective of whether questionnaires, for example, have been implemented through online means or through the traditional through paper and getting responses in a paper from a paper focused way. Another disadvantage, and this is one of the final disadvantages, I'm going to say sort of points I'm going to highlight, is that questionnaires can often require an amount or at least a percentage of literacy skills. Now, what this means is that those people who might, for example, have something to say about a particular topic, but either number one, they don't have the time to complete a questionnaire, and number two is that if they look to complete a questionnaire, they need someone around to actually help them go through it because their literacy skills might be inefficient. And number three is that there may be language barriers that coincide with the literacy skills. So generally speaking, when it comes to quantitative research, much like a little bit like qualitative research, and it ultimately depends on, dare I say it, how sexy the topic might be, that actually what happens is that generally speaking, the questionnaire, or much like the research focus or the research title, has to be kind of all encompassing in the sense that it has to have a broad appeal. And so basically, in this context, if that's the case, if it has kind of that broad appeal, then what happens is that even those questions that are difficult to answer, they could be answered in some way, but also to say that some questions or questionnaires are designed whereby, for example, they only capture a certain ethnicity's perspective or understanding around a specific topic, and therefore when trying to understand the topic from a different perspective or different race or ethnicity or background, for example, that might not be captured because, again, there may be literacy skills. And I'm going to say outrightly, it could be the thing around irrespective of sort of color or race. Generally speaking, questionnaires can be difficult, and people from all kinds of backgrounds can have literacy skill issues, and so therefore questionnaires there are advantages and disadvantages, and for the investigator, when approaching a specific research question or looking to get understanding around responses, implementing questionnaires, it's kind of a situation where investigators need to actually sort of get to know what's going on in from different backgrounds, thus to ensure you're gonna get sort of a maximus maximize on the responses as well. So basically, those are just some advantages and disadvantages. So let's get into something around the questionnaire design in the context of the survey process. So there's a couple of points I want to make here. So the research aim and research questions. So when looking at designing the context of the questionnaire, the research aim and research questions, they must be synonymous and coincide with the literature that surrounds that particular topic. So for example, if it's around a particular healthcare condition, there has to be some literature out there that sort of pertains to that area and focus, and thus when investigator looks to implement the research and has the capacity to put the design around this the design and the context of the survey in line with the literature, that actually makes the questionnaire makes it more attractive, and also makes it have a sort of smarter appeal. So investigators must know or should know aspects around have a research aim in mind, and have research questions aligned to what's been identified in literature retrospectively by peers and other investigators, authors and co-authors that have already contributed to a similar topic or the same topic. So that's kind of point number one about the questionnaire design in context of the survey process. The second part here is to identify the population and the sample. And I mentioned in the previous slides about advantages and disadvantages, that basically there can be advantages, there can be disadvantages in the context where there might be a population or groups of people where they might be, for example, that are normally would not ever consider getting involved in research, for example, but yet they want to, but then having to identify them and how to get sort of them recruited in research, or actually approach them, whether it be on the high street to complete a questionnaire, or to actually sort of send out a link where they can contribute or get involved in online, for example. That can be problematic, because not everyone wants to use, for example, the internet, or approach things through a link online, or they rather have other people around them to help them, for example, to complete a questionnaire, etc. So that might be people from white backgrounds, might be from people from black backgrounds, people from Asian ethnic minority ethnicities, and other groups. Generally speaking, when it comes to the questionnaire design, identifying the people and the population and the sample is kind of pertinent when in sort of the pilot, in the initial or the pilot stages of implementing a questionnaire. And by the way, in relating to the sample and the sample size, it's never good practice to actually say to actually aim for, say, for example, have above 100, or let's say 150 or 200 people participate in a questionnaire to complete a questionnaire based on that sort of sample size, unless the investigator is confident that they're gonna be able to approach the question, or the questionnaire can be approached from those from diverse backgrounds, and there has to be somewhere based on the research question where people are bound to be available or online, like in one way or another, so that the questionnaire is approachable from the get-go in this context. Now, the other point I want to make here is about decide how to collect replies. Now, sometimes people say, for example, in a questionnaire, in part of the questionnaire and the design, it might be basically things like what is referred to as a Likert scale, which is basically, excuse me, which is basically, for example, scoring scoring your answers based on, for example, a Likert scale from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, and 1 being the worst and 10 being the best. And basically, where the Likert scale offers kind of almost like a yes/no response, but actually there's no definite. A Likert scale is kind of given the investigator or the researcher a kind of an idea or understanding based on a couple of things. Based on, number one, that the researcher gets a response, that's one thing. And number two is basically maybe kind of from a non-intentional or subconscious perspective, where the participant answers the question and they're not really sure, but also they don't understand. They may not understand basically from a perspective where, for example, the research question or that question could have been said better, but they didn't want not to complete that question, so they put, like, for example, 5 or 6 when it could have been quite easily 2 or 10, for example. So that's kind of just kind of a sub side to deciding how to collect replies. But then there's also yes no answers, which are plain and simple. There are things like smiley faces, or using emojis in some way to collect responses and collect replies. And there's lots of other ways. There are at the end of this slide set, there is actually, or at the end of this workshop, there is a list of resources that people can actually that can be accessed at your own time, and you can check out those different resources for further understanding. And also around this decide how to collect replies, it's also ensuring that is knowing, again, going back to the literature is very important, because, for example, if you're going to design a question to get responses from, say, like a young population and around a specific topic, let's say, for example, in something relating to healthcare, then it's no point in having questions that are actually more pertinent in an older or middle-aged generation or group in that questionnaire, because young people won't know how to respond, or if they know how to respond, they're not going to be honest. And also it might not be, generally speaking, it might not be appropriate, for example. So knowing the literature around that is also a positive to ensure that you get the maximum response on a particular questionnaire, and deciding how to collect replies that can actually, when going to the literature, can actually help you inform how you should design your questionnaire from the get-go, from the beginning. Another point is basically the topic around this particular slide really is designing your questionnaire, which isn't obvious. Is basically knowing the processes that are involved, and there are methodology books out there that look at designing your questionnaire and how to do that. And on on the Re-Phew Consulting website, there are some resources to look at how to how to for example, there are services relating to doing literature reviews, or having support around literature reviews, for example. But to in the first place, apart from doing the literature review, in some contexts, it's also being able to ensure that when designing the questionnaire, it's knowing, for example, there's this terminology that's thrown about around quite a lot when it comes to collecting numerical data, and questionnaire data, and that is to that terminology is for example, knowing the demographic, or kind of almost like epidemiology, basically knowing um, the for example, around a particular topic, knowing who's more likely to respond to those questions. So first and foremost, is ensuring that the questionnaire is almost biased in one sense. Obviously, ultimately, a whole questionnaire should not be biased. So I want to make that point very transparent from the beginning. But ultimately, in one context, in another context, sorry, is knowing that the questionnaire can be approached by those from different backgrounds, and ensuring that the demographic is sort of going to be approached in the delivery of in delivering aspects of the questionnaire. Now that leads on to the next point, which is about running a pilot survey. Now, let's say, for example, you're looking to get, say, for example, 200 responses based on a questionnaire. Now, to get 200 responsive is no easy task. Basically, in this context, for example, what has to happen, or what should happen, is whereby the researcher and the investigator, apart from understanding what's highlighted in the literature about a specific focus topic on a topic or an area, is knowing where that survey can be piloted, where the investigator knows, or should know, where they're bound to, or they can potentially get a maximized number of participants to complete their survey. Now, that's in that context, to run a pilot survey, that's a best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that you could still approach a potential let's say, for example, that the survey is being done in an online way and you're collecting data online. Then basically there could be a group or a platform where the survey can be implemented through a link and completed by clicking on that link, for example. But what happens is that even in that scenario, the worst case scenario is that people might not be bothered. So basically, to get pilot data and to get sort of, for example, 200 responses, let's say, in a pilot, as part of a pilot survey, basically, the investigator must make sure that not only is the design of the questionnaire is good, and it's an approachable questionnaire, that also the questions shouldn't look arduous. They shouldn't look sort of long-winded, and they shouldn't look like, for example, that participants have to do a lot to actually complete the survey. So, for example, if it's, for example, you've got one question that could be related to a Likert scale, 1 to 10, for example, and then the next one might be relating to something like a yes/no, and then the next one could be a Likert scale again, and then the next one after that could be like to do with putting basically reflecting on someone's mood, or where a participant has to reflect on their mood and say how they felt in the last a couple of days or whatever, and that's the next question. Now, generally, when doing a questionnaire, developing a questionnaire, it should be almost theme based. So for example, page 1 could be sort of the more some of the more basic questions, which were based on a Likert scale. Then the next ones could be based on something that are a bit more challenging and require yes, no. And then the next one could be basically a mixture where it's basically highlighting or how they might feel, for example. So and in a pilot survey, obviously, if you want to get, if anyone wants to get so for example, in a pilot survey looking to get 200 responses, for example, the number of questions should be in some respects should be a kind of a minimal. So basically, let's say probably 10 or 15 questions, but they're very short and basic. So that should sort of help get maximize responses. And then the next point is about carrying out a main survey. So basically, let's say, for example, you've got pilot data around a pilot survey. The main survey would be to implement the same questions that the pilot did, but plus, like, for example, a few more that basically the investigator or the research team have been thinking about, but didn't think it would be appropriate to put those questions in a pilot survey because they know that they would be less likely to get a good positive response rate. So basically, to carry out a main survey should have basically 20 to 30 questions, let's say, instead of in addition, sorry, let me rephrase, sorry. So it would have 10 to 15 questions as the pilot survey, but then another 15 questions, so that would be about 30 around 30 questions around the whole survey. And then what should happen is the next step is to, once the responses have been gathered and identified, for example, the investigatory team should look to analyze that data. And there are simple, basic, easy to use packages, software packages out there. And some are used more in industry versus academia and vice versa. So knowing how the investigator or the research team is looking to present that work and what the audience is and how you're going to disseminate that work really depends on the package, on the software package that you're going to look to use to get analyze the data. So some software packages are more intertwined and fixed with industry, which actually give, or in some contexts, give a biased view. And then in academia, there's other packages which actually they also give a bit of they also have the ability to give biased view, but in the first place, because of how some of the packages or software packages are designed as well, it actually offers some software packages actually offer the investigator to analyze the data to ensure there's validity throughout, and then after that is the point I want to make here in relating to questionnaire design in the context of the survey process is actually then reporting findings and dissemination, and relating to how the research is going to be reported, and how the findings around that research or around the analysis of that data are going to be disseminated. Okay, I'm now going to just go through some context around the questionnaire design, and I'm going to describe just an illustration as part of this workshop, and it's a little bit similar to the steps that I've just mentioned. So first and foremost, there's the research aim and questions. there's the research population and sample, and in relating to that is the sample research population and sample size. Then there's the survey type, and then there's the method for collecting replies, and then being able to in that sort of initial phase, thinking about the analysis and how the data collection is going to be analyzed. And then the next step is so from left to right. From the left side is all those initial points I've made up to thinking about the analysis. Then going towards the right side is then developing the questionnaire or designing the questionnaire, and then going to pilot the survey. And then where I said in the previously is then to once initial pilot data has been identified, has been done, there's two processes. So some researchers would go ahead and run a lot of surveys straight away, knowing that the initial data that has been collected has been quite positive, so they won't think to redesign the questionnaire, for example. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, or it's not a terrible thing, because if there's a good positive response in a pilot, then ultimately it means that in one way or another, adding a few more questions and then doing another lot of survey implementation should potentially give more positive responses. Ultimately, every investigator has their own way of sort of going about the process. But after initial pilot data has been collected, some researchers would go back and they would redesign the questionnaire, or do the questionnaire design again. For example, if there are questions in there that kind of didn't have many responses, those questions can be omitted and replaced with different ones, or they can be omitted, and what it can tell those implementing or designing a survey is actually keeping the survey kind of short. Might be better. And then run the survey again, analyze the data, and then report the findings. And basically, again, as I mentioned, there are software packages that actually implement that can help implement that and help analyze and provide data in. There are software packages that actually give fancy statistical analysis around survey data that's been collected, or in basic research, so that people can understand the research, and alongside the rest of the questions that have been implemented, doing what's referred to as descriptive statistics is always one of the go-to focuses around implementing a survey, following as part of the analysis process of a questionnaire. So I'm going to give just an overview of what is a questionnaire. Obviously, I've made some points in the run up to coming to this particular slide, but I'm just going to highlight this in a few bullet points answering this question. So a questionnaire is a research tool for data collection. Usually is a set of structured questions for which answers can be coded and analyzed quantitatively or numerically. A questionnaire can also include open-ended questions, so a bit like qualitative research in some contexts, but at the same time, questionnaires have to be in some contexts have to be a bit more succinct, because people when completing questionnaires, they haven't got anyone in front of them to discuss that question, to highlight, to ask, for example, what does the investigator, or what they're really asking, for example. So having open-ended questions can throw off some participants in completing a questionnaire, but at the same time, it's good. It's important to have open-ended questions, but also having a mixture of those other semi-structured or semi-open-ended questions. And then questionnaires can be self-administered through through an interview. So basically, as part of, for example, a mixed methodology research, as whereby both quantitative and qualitative research is being implemented, and we'll get into that in one of the research methodology workshops a bit later. But research in this context, where a questionnaire is administered or self-administered through interview, is following normally when qualitative data collection has been done. For example, at the end, there may be a questionnaire for participants to complete as part of the interview process, because it might be the only time, for example, that participants are willing to complete a questionnaire, for example. So in this context, self-administered questionnaires can be done through an interview process. Then there's the different sort of ways or methodologies to implement questionnaires, and some of them I've mentioned. But for example, you can have online, you can have a postal questionnaire, you can have a telephone questionnaire, and you can have sort of like again a face-to-face questionnaire as part of the process. And then another point here is a questionnaire can also be used, as I mentioned, for qualitative analysis using semi-structured questions, and face-to-face or by telephone. So basically, qualitative, obviously, when it comes to questionnaire, always relate that to quantitative or numerical data being collected, but can be used for qualitative analysis, and can be used in relating to quantitative or mixed methodology research. So in generally in general terms, that is what a questionnaire is. So I'm going to give a couple of points, bullet points around the kind of the strengths around questionnaires, really. So one of the main things is that questionnaires can target a large number of people potentially. Reach respondents or participants broadly and in dispersed or different or diverse locations. Can be relatively low cost in time and in money to implement. Relatively easy to get information from people quickly. Can be standardized and structured questions. So again, the terminology in some contexts is synonymous, where the terminology or wording around standardized and structured is almost synonymous with terminology that relates to open-ended or semi-structured questions. So in some context, using the words standardized and structured questions are the same in some ways. And then another strength is analysis can be straightforward and quite quick, and responses can be pre-coded. So for example, based on the number, based on a question and the number of responses, that question can be pre-coded, and that would be a code or some context where only the investigator or the research team would know about, so that they know that that question is important, for example, versus the others. And so in pilot data, that's it's important to know that. And then when rolling out a more robust survey, for example, or questionnaire, then they know, for example, that question that was pre-coded with the other with other questionnaires is has more priority in this in a questionnaire design. So those are some of the strengths there. And then there's also surveys or questionnaires can cover activities and behavior, knowledge and attitude and preferences according to different research questions. There's another point where questionnaires can be used to describe and compare and contrast and explain. And another point is questionnaires can be effective for collecting numerical data, as mentioned, but information that can be counted or measured, which is generally effective. And then the questionnaires can be can assess low pressure for participants or respondents, and questionnaires can highlight the lack of interview bias, and basically another way to kind of offset interview bias, and it's not really perhaps the best way to do things, but it's not unheard of, and it's not going against any particular rules or anything. Is the possibility when implementing a questionnaire is to have what's referred to as a ghost interviewer effect, or a ghost interviewer. So that means basically where you have someone who knows that knows the subject based on the literature, for example, and they design or put together the questions based on what is needed in the field, or what is a requirement in the field in relating to bridging a gap in knowledge, for example. But when it comes to actually the implementation of the survey itself or the questionnaire, it's there's a possibility of having someone else involved to implement the questionnaire, so that it reduces the bias, research bias, and response bias in some context as well. And this is more important in actually both sort of face-to-face research interview questions or questionnaires, and online, because in both of those methodologies of collecting data, there is the possibility of research bias on both sides, and so having a ghost interviewer can be advantageous, but those things, aspects and some of the strengths around that have to be sort of ironed out with those who the investigator is sort of is collaborating with, or has part of their team, for example. So those are some strengths I'm highlighting, and then I'm going to highlight some points around the limitations. Some of these points are kind of made already, but I'm just going to give an overview here. So one of the limitations is be ready and not surprised that you might get a low response rate, and this might be because of bias, because bias doesn't automatically mean that because the topic is well known about, for example, or a subject entity is known about both by investigator and participants, it doesn't mean to say that that automatically that there's going to be a massive response rate, because the topic is not just that it's known about, but how it's being implemented might show that there's some bias in that context. So for example, if it's around a particular health condition, let's say, then the bias could be that the way it's implemented, it might only be implemented on a certain a certain group, or around a group who have that particular health condition, when actually what should potentially happen is that is getting a perspective from those who might be, for example, suspects or high risk for that condition as well. So that's some of the limit. There can be limitations around that. There can also be limitations about having a lack of confidence in the results, and basically, for example, if there's a low again, with alongside with obviously with low response rate and having sort of a lack of responses, when getting, let's say for example, you implemented a survey, you look to have a sample size of about 100 over 100, let's say 200 responses, but you only get like 10 10 responses, then obviously the confidence around the results should tell you, or should inform, that actually the response rate is or the low response rate informs that actually there's no or little confidence in the initial results. And that's why in a previous slide, there's this as part of the questionnaire design, it's also about going back to the questionnaire and see what can be done different, and then updating and basically implementing again, ensuring that there's more a possibility of maximizing on getting more positive results in implementing the survey, the questionnaire again. Then the questionnaire, one of the other limitations is having it could be unsuitable for some people. So again, there might be people that you want to have that should be looking to complete the questionnaire, but generally subconsciously the investigator knows that some people will have problems completing the survey, owing to perhaps potentially because of literacy levels, or health literacy levels. If for example, if the research survey or the questionnaire is around a particular health condition. So let's say for example that there are low literacy levels, then the investigator needs to know, or should know, how that can be bettered, how that can be remedied. So unsuitable could be unsuitable for some people, but how do you address that? So this is just to highlight, obviously this is a couple of the limitations that also in this context, obviously there's poor literacy. People can have poor literacy levels or low literacy levels. They could be visually impaired. They could be too young. It might not be even. So for example, let's say this is kind of off the beaten track kind of perspective, but you have, for example, say that you have a questionnaire that's being implemented in adult population, and you're looking to get responses from a wide range of adult age groups, starting from the age from, let's say, a young adult from 17 or 18 years old, and then all the way up to 17 or 18 plus. Now, even if you have like someone who is 17 or 18 complete the questionnaire, it could from one perspective, it is to say that you might get people who are bound to complete the questionnaire, but at the same time, when completing the questionnaire, it might be that even they don't understand the questionnaires completely. So don't be kind of fooled into thinking that, for example, young adults, for example, even if they complete the questionnaire, that they're being fully honest about that, and it could be down to, for example, I'm getting into some aspects of the integrity around the integrity and the issues that lie within aspects of healthcare here, and that is to say that young adults, although they might complete a questionnaire, it might be that it could also be that they're not that on the one hand they could be mature, but from a mature perspective they could complete the questionnaire, but it might not be completely appropriate to have them in completing the questionnaire. So for example, another thing could be, for example, for example, you can have a 13 or 14-year-old, even though the questionnaire is designed for a young adult, and you have a 13 or 14-year-old completing the questionnaire, it could be completely wrong, because basically the question does not apply to that age range, and basically it's important to know the limitations. And then another limitation is that it's not online versus online. So there are limitations around that. So and there is literature to say that to inform that one modality of collecting data through online means through online versus traditional techniques is more favorable, especially in today's day and age, for example. And then another limitation could be around question or wording can have major effect on answers. So that again comes down to the context around age versus maturity in some context as well. And then there's the limitation around misunderstandings cannot be easily corrected or cannot be corrected. So basically, depending on how the question was asked in a questionnaire, it could be easily misconstrued, it could be misunderstood. So knowing how to design a questionnaire in the first place is primitive practice in any area of developing sort of part of quantitative research. And so another limitation is that it can be difficult to account for cultural and language differences. And again, that sort of aligns back down to sort of literacy or health literacy issues. So basically, knowing that let's say, for example, you've got a diverse group of people completing that you want to complete a questionnaire. That all might be well and good, but knowing that they can actually, for example, if the questionnaire is designed in the English language, then the responses as such should also be in the English language. If you have a questionnaire and researchers haven't, there is research out there in areas of healthcare that have been implemented in more than one language. But let's say, for example, you say something in one language, in the English language, and you say the same thing in a different language. From a cultural perspective, and even from a general language and literacy perspective, it might not mean the main. It may have different connotations. It might not mean the same thing. So understanding the translations is important. And if it's not appropriate to have it in a different language, then English language, to have a questionnaire based in the English language from the beginning is going to be the only way to actually implement a questionnaire and look to get responses either way, whether positively or negatively. Some other limitations could be there are little opportunities or no opportunities to probe and develop answers. So what that really means is once answers have been identified, if answers have been linked to to helping the investigator to understand the question and the research the research and the question as well, then it's about knowing how to when overall analysis has been done. And I've given the example where descriptive analysis could be the best way to get baseline understanding around a particular question. Then it's knowing how the overall analysis can be interpreted to bring about summary and conclusion to the particular question that is being asked. And another limitation could be that there's a little control over the context and order of questions, and how they are answered in postal surveys. So once a survey has been designed, a questionnaire has been designed and implemented, and let's say again it's been implemented online and in traditional ways through postal survey, for example. Once done in postal survey and even actually online, there's actually a little or no control that the investigator has after it's been implemented. You're basically leaving the questionnaire to its own fate, in the hope that basically you're going to get some sort of responses. So that's important, and it's a sort of a situation where research around a particular questions can be quite risky, and so then it's important to go back to the literature to actually highlight, to understand how the questions should be phrased, and even learning from how peers and colleagues and co-authors in particular research papers, for example, have implemented the questions. And then another limitations could be that there's whether an investigator or part of an investigatory team, and whether in industry or whether in academia, there's no check or little check on incomplete responses. So what that means is that, for example, let's say for example you've got 30 questions in a survey, in a questionnaire, and then you've got let's say for example let's say you've got your 200, there's 200 samples, and they've all been received. After the analysis, or part of the analysis, or throughout the analysis process, the main thing is to actually look at the question with the questions, with the questions, the responses. And normally what the sort of go-to situation is where the investigator or the research team, for example, only look to get or analyze the data that are based on the responses that have been received. No one really, or there is very little out there to highlight about what responses have been received, or sorry, how little responses that have been received based on questions that have not had responses. So it's important to understand that, and also understand that the limitation around that is that there's little or no check on incomplete responses in that context. And also in this context is basically you can have a question that has, for example, part A, part B, part C, part D, for example, and for example in that A, B, C, D scenario, only part, let's say B and D are actually have actually had responses. And so basically in some context, some researchers would say that's an incomplete response, because you need all parts A, B, C, and D completed, or you would need to find a way to when it comes to analyzing the data or the research, then it's understanding that B and D were the only responses, and you have to then, the investigator or research team has to honestly inform, as part of the analysis and a part of the dissemination or the writing up process and the dissemination of that work, knowing that that has not actually received any responses, or there's been a little response about the around the other questions. Another limitation is the design issues with moving through online surveys, and that's no surprise because basically there's there's a lot of researchers through different generations work in different ways to get responses through questionnaires or surveys. And generally speaking, it's knowing how to sort of ensure that whether doing face-to-face sort of questionnaires or asking questionnaires questionnaires as part of qualitative research through face-to-face meetings or face-to-face efforts, or sort of face-to-face interviews, or going through doing things online. In some context would actually for example, could be more harm than good in relating to getting sort of a number of responses. So ensuring that there's a good design around the questionnaire is important, because ultimately there would be limitations through online as well as some of the traditional ways in terms of trying to maximize the response rate. And another one of the final limitations is that seeking information only by asking, can we trust people say, can we trust what people say? So examples, issues with over-reporting. So for example, when asking a question, we might get you might get truthful answers, honest answers, which is what we all which every investigator looks to adhere to and ensure. But what can happen is that when the questionnaire or question around in a questionnaire around a particular topic or a subject entity, it could be very pertinent or very it could even be a sensitive topic, but it's a topic that a question that a participant might have experienced, you know, quite recently, for example. And then when they complete the questionnaire, apart from, for example, the Likert scale saying one was the worst and 10 was the best, and they've ticked 1 because they had the worst experience. Apart from that, they may then comment when add a comment when the questionnaire doesn't require a comment. So then there can be over reporting in context with that, when actually in questionnaire research, or sorry, in quantitative research, the bit that has been commented, or the comments, they're not always not always included. And actually even though there are comments, some researchers would decide to actually add a few notes around the comments that have been identified, but ultimately that can lead to over-reporting, and that can be problematic in questionnaire as part of questionnaire designs, but it can be problematic in analyzing quantitative research when there may be some qualitative context as part of that, when there doesn't need to be, and that does not need to be analyzed. But that's down to the discretion of the investigator. So a few techniques for maximizing the response rate. So one of the main things obviously is to have a good design, a good questionnaire design, a thoughtful layout, something that's easy to follow, simple questions, having a good a questionnaire that has appeal or appearance, an appearance, having a good length to particular questions. Nothing, if you have a question in questionnaires that are too lengthy, then the participants are going to be too bored to even bother to participate and complete the question. So having a good length to the questionnaire is important. The degree of intrigue and importance is important. The ethical issues around that particular question have to be focused, so that the for example, if it's a question that is sensitive but not sensitive but not sensitive so much so that the that participant's going to break down as soon as they see in the question, then ensuring that ethical issues around that are addressed before the question is asked in a questionnaire format. That's important. And ensuring that there's some pre-context in a questionnaire to ensure that participants know what the questionnaire is about and why they've been approached, or why they're getting involved, or what and also at the end of the questionnaire to say that the investigator thanks the participants for taking time to get in to completing the questionnaire. That's very important. So I mentioned some context around pre-notification. Explanation of selection is important. In questionnaires, as part of a cover letter, so you can have a questionnaire with some context at the header of the questionnaire, but you can have a separate sheet which highlights some aspects around the questionnaire, and which highlights basically a letter of introduction, or a cover sheet, or even a cover letter to highlight what the research is about. And then on the next page, when for example, the first question is going to be where the first question of or the first 5 questions are going to be, for example, there can be some pre-context on that page as well. So ensuring that these techniques are followed should hopefully maximize the response rate. And it sounds quite lengthy, but actually having having steps in designing a research questionnaire should actually be a kind of a rewarding process. Another context is about incentives. Now, in academic research versus industry research, there are things there is context to say, for example, there shouldn't be any real incentive in academic research because that brings neutrality to the whole research process throughout, and it brings again, as in one of the previous workshops, I talked a little bit about validity and rigor and trustworthiness in relating to research quality, validity and ethics. Now, in relating to incentives, generally whether qualitative or quantitative, so whether collecting numerical data in questionnaire through questionnaires, or collecting data through asking questions in through interview type question scenario, then basically incentives should not be part of that process. If what you want to add, if investigators want to ensure that there's rigor and integrity through the way that they've asked the question. So, for example, in healthcare research, incentives are really sort of not part of the process, not really. However, I mean, whilst I say that, there are a few exceptions, but I won't go into that. There are small future. Another point is there can be, for example, an investigator can, for example, highlight as part of this research, there are small future incentives. For example, a grand prize or vouchers, for example, for participation in this research, and that they would get those incentives, or they would get those later on. So in one way, if they get involved at that time, it brings the trustworthiness around the data collection at sort of the first point of premise. And then another point is understanding why is ensuring that participants who get involved to complete a questionnaire, and in relating to techniques for maximizing the response rate, is providing the participants an understanding of why and how important having them involved to complete the questionnaire. That's absolutely pivotal, because no one can complete or get decent research results, whether research is landed as potentially negative or positive. It's very important to ensure that researchers, for example, researchers and investigators, that they let those people who are involved in research, or they're looking involved to get involved in research, that they let them know that their involvement is absolutely pinnacle, because basically in a line to healthcare research as well, for example, it's almost equivalent to say that if you don't let them know, then you cannot expect the participant to actually comply with what you're asking, but also they're not going to tell you the truth about in anything that relates to that particular research. So it's important to have that as part of the process. Some other techniques for maximizing the responses is reminders, highlighting more aspects, and sort of emphasizing almost aspects around confidentiality and anonymity. And if you're looking to collect a research responses through sort of postal questionnaires, as well as online interviews, for example, is in one way to maximize the response rate through postal questionnaires, is ensuring that once a questionnaire is posted out, that there is a prepaid envelope or return envelope that participants can, once completing the surveys, can put in these interviews and post back. So that can be quite good, and it's one of the ways traditionally that has been used by a number of investigators in published research to highlight a way for maximizing the response rate. So I'm now just going to highlight a few things around sort of wording or terminology of things to avoid. So these are a couple of points. Abbreviations. So abbreviations is a bit of an ongoing issue, because, for example, there are terminologies or abbreviations that have similar abbreviations. So one word can have an abbreviation that can actually mean have an abbreviation exactly the same as another word. And so basically avoiding abbreviations is good, but if there are abbreviations, then it's important to have those abbreviations clear in brackets next to the full word, for example. And another context is having another thing to avoid really is to have alternative meanings. So basically, for example, so this kind of this is quite intriguing example, is basically where you have so in a sentence, in part of a research questionnaire, someone could be asking something relating to something around what they did in the daytime, or whatever, and they can actually ask, for example, relating to a question related to a question that they want a response around. Before they get to before a participant responds to that, the investigator might ask some other question, a question that that might not have any particular intent around that, and then because the investigator might use terminology that is basic, the participant will use the same word terminology, but then when asking the actual question and the same terminologies are being used, for example, then when it comes to the respondent's question, if they've answered in using the same terminology, but then actually you want the investigator wants them to be a bit more involved in actually getting the response in when or let's say a bit more specific when answering a question as part of a questionnaire. The terminology should not be related to terminology that for example, could mean, like, for example, let's say, did you have a good day today, or something like that, and the response in this context could mean, yeah, it was, I had a cool day, a cool day. And then when answering a question as part of the questionnaire, that requires that might have, for example, might have that same terminology in, it should not throw off the participant. It shouldn't throw off the participant, but also the investigator, when coming to analyzing the data, knows that the response that participant gave based on that question doesn't mean the same thing, or if it does, it's knowing that that can't be. It may not. It may cause the investigator to report or analyze that particular question amongst all of the responses that are received in a different way. So that's important. So it's a thing. It's a thing to avoid in relating to wording and terminology. And so another one is ambiguity and vague wording. So again, things like fairly, generally, you, and the respondent, and household and family. Those things are kind of vague terminology. So it can cause problems. And a double-barreled terminologies. So for example, double-barreled questions. For example, let's say, for example, you have a question that say, do you speak English or French? So in the question, that can throw off participants. So it's better to have a question that is one or the other. For example, if it's double, to prevent double-barreled, it's about having bullet points on English on different languages, for example. So that's it's one thing. It should be avoided, but terminology is one of those important paradoxes that everyone has to make sure when designing a questionnaire is important from the beginning. And there's double-barreled, and there's also double negatives. So there are examples in the references that I'll give that are highlighted in this presentation. Those checking out this workshop can check out the resources to find some examples around double negatives as well. And inappropriate categories. So there's questions in questionnaires that are completely inappropriate around particular categories. And so I'm not going to go into detail around those, but there are books and resources and paper publications that kind of look into that delve into that. Another few points here are things to avoid. So leading questions, they're absolutely kind of problematic, and they should be avoided. Memory issues as well, they should be avoided. And social desirability is another issue, and question complexity. So a question complexity really relates to basically in one way, question complexity relates to, for example, the investigator wants to get a specific response from participants, and in order to do so on purpose makes the question complex, so it actually then goes in the favor of getting a almost what's referred as a research bias, or having research bias or bias reporting. So on purpose question complexity can be used in questionnaires in that context. So that's very important to kind of take notice of. Um, so a few other things to think about are here. Our missing categories include other. So missing categories could be things like include other, don't know, and not applicable. They are things that can throw off participants looking to complete the question or questionnaire, and rather even so, for example, even the best kind of design questionnaires can offer opportunity for participants to complete, but at the same time, basically, there can be episodes, for example, where the participant also thinks, well, might decide other on everything, or they don't know, or not applicable, and that could be for a number of reasons why they thought to sort of rather than completing or choosing one of the things that can be marked in a questionnaire, they've chosen to write, for example, NA for not applicable, or other, or don't know, or and so on and so forth. And another thing, and I've mentioned this a little bit before about sensitive questions. They're things to think about. And question ordering, that's kind of a pivotal point, because when questions are asked around specific issues, or around particular areas of healthcare, for example, then question ordering should be sort of sequential with the way the investigator is looking to, in one way, get responses, and that doesn't mean in related to being having a research bias, or bias in related to bias reporting. It's actually just making sure that there's good flow in the way the questions have been put together. So that's important. And open or closed questions. It's good to have a mix, but in most cases, where good questionnaires, when it comes to good questionnaires, there's apart from having a mix, by having sort of open-ended questions, it kind of leaves the participant sort of to interpret, to think about or reflect on the question as well. So that's kind of quite good, versus quite positive, versus closed questions, which can be kind of give the demeanor or the character of being kind of being quite mean in some way. So it's important to have a mix in that context. So a closed question would be, for example, where there's a choice of alternative replies. An open question might be might require written text or spoken answers. So important to have a good a mixture. So that's the end of this particular workshop. I'm sorry, I apologize to those who are listening that this is a little bit over. This page here highlights some references. One of the sort of go-to publications actually is one by Cresswell, which was a Sage Publications. It was in his second edition in 2003, but I think there's been more later. There's been more recent additions to this. Cresswell in the book called Research Design. There's a chapter relating to qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method approaches. And Chapter 10 apparently in that is very is one of the go-to chapters in this particular publication. There is a book also there is actually another book by Baxter, Hughes, and Tite, titled "How to Research," and it's a publication from 2006 by the Open University Press, and Chapter 6 highlights some particular context. There are some sort of peer review publications out there that align to this. Align to this work as well, and hopefully in the next workshop, or in if not in the next workshop, in one of these workshops, I will highlight a few additional resources. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and obviously part of the Re-Phew Consulting Re-Phew Consulting workshops here online. It offers hopefully an opportunity for those listening and checking out this to kind of stop, kind of pause, take notes, and hopefully add can serve as a resource really to some of that professional development that those of you are going through. So thank you for listening, and hopefully look forward to providing an overview in the next workshop, which will hopefully be around about developing a literature review. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good one. Take care. Bye.